I'm also thinking of my own dad, and of my father-in-law, and of my grandfathers, may they rest in peace. I'm thinking of my godchildren, 2 of whom have kids of their own now. I'm even thinking of the college kids who lived in the dorms I used to supervise in Sewanee, the ones who called me Papa Jim. Then, of course, there's all of those other father figures in my life, teachers, priests, other mentors. Some of them helped me find myself as I was growing up. Some of them continue to help me find myself as I seek to grow and learn who it is that God is calling me to be yet again. There's a lot for me to celebrate today, and I'm excited that I'm back here with all of you on this day so that you can be a part of that celebration too. And I'm excited that unlike some years, I'm actually in the pulpit on Father's Day instead of traveling. Or rather, I should say that I was excited to be preaching today until I got a good look at the gospel lesson. Because right there in the middle of the 10th chapter of Matthew is a verse that really doesn't seem like it belongs on this day. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. And children will rise against parents and have them put to death. A father will betray his child to death? I can't imagine a single circumstance that would provoke me to do such a thing to my son, or to one of my godchildren, or to one of those dorm residents who used to call me Papa Jim. I would rather die myself than betray my child or any children in such a horrible way. Which of you here this morning who are dads wouldn't stand up here with me and swear the same? How could Jesus say such a thing? It's in accounts like this morning's gospel passage that we meet the Jesus I find most difficult to like and put up with. The morose Jesus, the apocalyptic Jesus who preaches gloom and doom. The Jesus who, were he to utter the things from this pulpit in person today, the things that we heard from him in the gospel lesson, would be sent to a psychologist. This is something different from the gentle Jesus who teaches us helpful hints for happy living, or from the do-gooder Jesus who heals the sick and feeds the hungry, or even from the noble Jesus who selflessly lays down his own life while insisting that his friends be allowed to go free. The Jesus we meet this morning is confusing, disturbing. He says things we just can't bear to hear. He won't just give us something easily uplifting. Rather, he insists on telling us dark truths and forcing us to deal with them. But it may also be this Jesus who most reveals to us that he was truly one of us, truly human. Because this Jesus has obviously seen the darker side of life. This Jesus has obviously witnessed the horrible evil to which we are all too prone. This Jesus knows that even though we may wish to ignore it, some parents do abandon their children, or neglect them, or abuse them, or even kill them. And that these parents are not just out there among the heathen, that we can even find them within faith communities. And some of them even use passages from the Bible or other tenets of our faith as justification for their behavior. It's simply a reality that there are some people who, for their own comfort, safety, pride, greed, whatever, will sell out even their own children. Jesus knows that. And in this morning's passage from Matthew, he warns us, his followers, that we too can fall victim to this evil, just as many others in the world so tragically do. Faced with this sort of evil, it's no wonder that even persons of profound faith do their best to ignore the implication in this verse and look for an easier way out. Some commentators that I've read simply gloss over it by stating that the tearing apart of families is a common feature of the end times in Jewish and Christian apocalyptic writings, and that Jesus' use of this image simply is there to help us identify everything he's saying as a prediction for the end. Or, by including these words here, other commentators suggest Matthew might just be addressing uncertainty in his own community. Maybe Jesus didn't actually say these words at all, and Matthew simply puts them in to tip his own community off that this is a promise of God's presence for the end times. That there was a community facing persecution and that they needed the hope of the second coming of Christ and God's final wrestling with evil. And from one angle, the analysis presented by these commentators is correct. But by stopping with this kind of an analysis, we would leave unstated the obvious, which is that such an abomination as child abuse could only become part of the imagination of how the calamitous end of the world will appear by being a horrific evil experienced in the now. No one could dream up something so terrible without it already having a painful place in the cultural memory of a people. By predicting this horrible scene in the end times, Jesus also explicitly implies that child abuse is a real evil already in the lives of many. Now, there are other commentators who, while acknowledging that Jesus is not only predicting future evil, but also acknowledging current evil, are quick to try and correct this evil by turning to a dualism that says that weak human fathers can be expected to turn on their children due to human depravity. God, on the other hand, in this view, is sort of an uber father, the perfect, ideal father, the only real father, of whom human fathers are merely hopelessly flawed shadows. In this view, the real father would never be abusive to his children. We humans are bad. God is good. Simple as that. But such an approach also ultimately fails because it leaves an unanswered question. Why does this good God leave some of his children, the ultimate innocents, unprotected in the face of such a betrayal of trust and basic decency as abuse or neglect by a parent? And it also ignores the cry of Christ himself from the cross. My God, why have you abandoned me? Jesus himself felt betrayed by his Father. This dualism of bad human, good God wouldn't work for Jesus in his darkest hour, and it fails to work for many who have had to face the reality of evil. Theologian David Blumenthal asserts that if God is such a father as this dualism proposes, then God is also therefore guilty of abuse for allowing his children to be abused. And Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, held the position that although God definitely exists and that God is undoubtedly the father of humankind, that God is a thug who's not to be trusted and without whom we would probably be better off. The only logical end of the dualistic approach to the problem of abuse is that we end up left alone and terrified. But Jesus, who would himself acknowledge that he felt abandoned in his darkest hour, still urges us, do not be afraid. If a sparrow, a tiny, seemingly insignificant bird, does not die without God noticing, then neither do any of us suffer or die without God noticing. God does not, possibly cannot, stop the death of the sparrow. But the tiny creature is never out of God's notice and care. And therefore we can deduce that though God may be powerless to stop the abuse of a child at the hand of a parent, that child is, like the sparrow, never forgotten, nor ultimately abandoned. I don't pretend to have an explanation for the existence of evil, especially for evil so great as the neglect or abuse of a child by his or her own father or mother. Nor do I want to be seen as excusing anyone, God included, for the existence of this evil in the world. But we Christians do know that even faced with such evil as the abuse of a child by a parent, there is still reason for hope. We know that Jesus, who himself felt alone and cried out his feelings of abandonment in those last moments on the cross, was not ultimately abandoned. God raised Christ from the grave and gave him new and everlasting life. A life not just in the memory of his friends, but a real life in a restored and renewed physical body. And so the promise holds for us as well. The victims of child abuse, of any abuse or evil, can also expect that same resurrection. Resurrection from the grave prisons created in the mind of a victim that can lead to a repetition of the same abuse as it is inflicted on other innocents. Resurrection from the grave denial of family and society, which all too often allows such abuse to be perpetrated repeatedly. Resurrection from the grave fear and hopelessness of one who is alone that can lead to self-loathing and self-abuse. Resurrection even from the graves in the cemeteries, which are the only deliverance from abuse for far too many children. And we also have the reassuring knowledge that God, through Jesus Christ, truly knows what it is to suffer. God knows the pain of abuse and abandonment, and so we can have an assurance that those who are abused do not suffer alone. God's memory of abuse is triggered by the experience of God's abused children. And God suffers with them when they are abused. I wish that God would just make the suffering of innocence disappear. But for whatever reason, that's not how the world works. But what God does do is promise that we do not suffer alone, that we are not forgotten, that we will in the end be cared for and vindicated. In the end, we know that most human parents, imperfect as we all are, will never neglect or abuse their children. In fact, as we look around us, we see the opposite of abuse and neglect. Scraped knees tenderly nursed when a child falls off a bicycle while learning to ride. Diligent parents joining together in neighborhood watches to protect their children from all sorts of violence and evil. foster parents taking in the unwanted and the abandoned, quiet vigils and unwavering presence for children in all sorts of times of sickness or pain or confusion. Experiencing the love of fathers or father figures is in itself a reason to celebrate on this day, despite our knowledge of the atrocious behavior of some parents. But even more so, we know that God ultimately never abandons us, never leaves us to face abuse alone, never leaves us without hope of resurrection from whatever grave we might be facing. No evil, no abuse, no fear is ever a match for the power of God's love to ultimately restore us. Cycles of abuse can be broken. Broken spirits can be made new. Hollow souls can feel love again. And even the grave can be emptied. And that's an even greater reason to celebrate this day. So happy Father's Day to all of us.